everyone. We're going to continue our move through the wonderful world of social psychology today and start talking about social influence. The predominant theme you're going to see through all of this today is basically just group thinking, okay? The impact of groups on an individual's singular behavior, okay? So that's going to be a pretty significant component to be paying attention to as we move on. So social influence is probably the greatest contribution of social psych in the sense of looking at the viewpoint that we see with attitudes, beliefs, decisions, and how all of those things get really, really, really heavily impacted by the actions of others. We've had many conversations in years past, or well, not in years past, but in lessons past about the perception of peer pressure, how that impacts a lot of what you do, expectations of parents, expectations of teachers, expectations of friends, all of those things very heavily influence what it is that you ultimately end up acting on. And so one of those biggest pieces within this social influence dynamic is a role. You heard me make reference to these earlier in the social thinking notes, but roles are just absolutely critical in recognizing the significance of social psychology on a person. So a role is what society defines as expectations of your behavior in a particular group or setting, all right? So the roles that you assume every day are going to result from things like your interests, your talents, your goals. But it's also possible to recognize that in many respects, some of the behaviors you operate on with regard to your roles are imposed on you. Many girls wear makeup. Why? Because it's perceived to be a girly thing to do. Things like, expectations of your parents. Maybe you took this AP course because parents expected it of you to try really hard in school and take really challenging courses. In any case, your role prescribes on your behavior, okay? So it ultimately is going to end up dictating how you act by making it obvious to you what you should do, how you should do it, and when. So for example, me in this role right now that I'm fulfilling, I'm a teacher. That's what I'm doing. That's why I make these videos, is to provide this information to you in your role as a student. That makes it pretty obvious then, ultimately, what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to have all of your lessons set and ready to go as we move into these various different units. How I should go about doing it. I can't just, give you guys lessons in this all of this content in crazy ways. I have to do them in a very set and established manner. I have to follow my curriculum based off of what College Board mandates, that I have to have you guys done with content by a certain point. And so all of that corresponds to my role. It's important to recognize that within those roles that we hold, much of what governs them is norms. And this is a term, again, that you've been presented with from me in numerous units before this point. But to remind you of what it is, a norm, a social norm, because it's not the same as like a norm in terms of IQ testing distributions or standardized testing distributions or anything like that. A social norm is a group's expectations of what's considered to be appropriate and acceptable in terms of behavior and thought. Okay, so these can be like, very broad kinds of guidelines, religious views, policies, politics, or they could be very specific, in the sense that the expectation for people when they're in libraries, or what they're now referenced as media centers, you're supposed to be quiet there, okay? Social norms can guide conversations, like what's acceptable to discuss. It's not considered to be socially normal, for example, for a man to ask a woman her weight or her age, right? That's considered to be an inappropriate thing to say. It guides things like dress code. Here in offices, you're supposed to wear certain things with regard to business attire, not t-shirts or anything like that. I looked out. I go to work in an office, so on Fridays, like today, I can wear t-shirts and jeans and things like that. But there are some school districts where that's not acceptable. And so that guides my behavior on the fact that I work here in our district. Or it could just be unwritten rules. It doesn't have to be just laws or expectations for things. It's a social norm, for example, that you as a student are supposed to sit there and listen attentively when a teacher's talking to you. So norms are just absolutely integral in trying to understand what it is ultimately that guides our behavior in terms of various different group dynamics. All right, so let's talk about conformity and obedience. Unfortunately, it looks like my screen here got a little jacked up, and I'm going to apologize for that. I didn't realize that the formatting was so off kilter, so we're going to try our best to maneuver through this. Conformity is not the same as obedience, and compliance isn't the same as obedience either. These are three very, very, very important terms to social psychology that you have to be able to tell the difference between. The reality is behavior is contagious. We follow what others do. We are very much guided by that observational learning principle of monkey see, monkey do, for all intents and purposes. You've heard me reference you guys as being sheeple all the time, and I've called you out on numerous occasions for the fact that you don't all get done taking a test at the exact same time. Someone sits and they wait for that brave soul to stand up and go turn their test in, and magically like 16 other kids start rising out of their desks, and they all turn their test in at the same time. We follow the behaviors of others to conform. We want to fit in. We want to be part of the everyday norm, because ultimately, if we aren't, we perceive ourselves as being on the outside looking in, or we perceive ourselves as being viewed negatively. I mean, think about why you sit there and you wait for that first person to turn their test in. You don't want everybody judging you. You don't want them sitting there saying, oh, well, they're clearly not knowing their content, so they just turned it in because they didn't even try. Okay? You don't want to be that person that just turns it in first, so you're waiting, right? So let's talk about the concept of conformity and a definition, okay? Within the field of psychology, and social psych in particular, we say that conformity is when we adjust our behavior or thought process to coincide and connect in line with what a group establishes as standard. Okay, so let's be real here. I'm going to make a Mean Girls reference. What day do we wear pink? Wednesday. What is that ultimately? That's a means of conformity. All of those girls that are in that group are going to follow Regina George's model, if you will, and they're going to conform and wear that color on that day to coincide because that's the group's established standard, right? So one of the most landmark studies out there within psychology is from Solomon Asch's work back in the 50s when he was studying the impact of conformity. And so you're going to hear it often referenced as kind of like a chameleon effect circumstance, the infamous line experiment. Okay, so there's plenty of ways that you're going to hear it referenced. Now, here's what Asch attempted to establish. He brought people into kind of a boardroom style setup, round table, had quite a few individuals that were in there in the study. And he showed them this image right here. Okay, here's your standard line, and then here are these comparison lines. And he had the researchers ask the participants which of the comparison lines was equitable to the standard. Now, to those of us looking at this, we would say pretty obviously, well, it's clearly 2. What's going to happen, though, if some of these participants are plants placed there because they're involved in the research experiments with Asch, and what if they give the noticeably wrong answer to this? And they say 1. It's very close to that standard line. It's clearly not accurate. What happens if all of these other individuals in this group say number 1 is the clear answer in terms of it being the same as that standard line? Will the true participants in that research piece follow along? Will they conform? Will they give the wrong answer? Or will they step up and say, yeah, y'all are crazy. It's not 1, it's 2. Answer to that question? 1/3 of the participants regularly conformed to the unanimous but very wrong group answer, and an average of 75% of the participants, so 3 in 4, conformed at least once. They were insanely impacted by the group dynamics there. They didn't want to be on the outside looking in. They didn't want to rock the boat, so they gave the wrong answer. Maybe some of them were confused and questioning themselves, saying, like, maybe I am seeing something that these individuals are not. But ultimately, what is clear here in the result of Asch's study is that we are prone to align our behavior to a group standard when it is very highly present. Okay? So what's other kind of conditions out there that can impact and influence your level of conformity? We know the size of the group matters because the reality is the more that there are people present in a group, the more likely one is to conform. Okay, if it's just 2 people in there, then it's not really going to have that kind of an impact. But if it's 3 or more, it most certainly will. The status of the group matters too. Okay, so the lower your status in a group, the more likely you are to conform. So think of all of we'll do the Mean Girls reference again. All of Rachel McAdams' character, all of the other little people that are kind of following her around when she's Regina George. So the lower your status, the more likely you are to conform with what everyone else is doing. Your observations of the group matter too, because if the decision is made in private and there's a sense of anonymity, we are less likely to conform. Okay, we're more likely to kind of stick to our guns. But the reality is the fact that so many of those pseudo-participants were unanimous that made the likelihood of that conformity to occur far more likely, okay? Because we will have more conformity present in a group when all of the other group members agree. And so those are important distinctions to keep in mind for yourself. So what are ultimately some of the explanations that are given? Because, I kind of gave a little bit of a conjecture piece there to why some of those individuals ended up giving the wrong responses in Asch's study. But overall, just in general, what are reasons why we attempt to conform and align our behavior to a group standard? One of the reasons is, or ways that we do it, is normative social influence. Okay? We want to avoid the rejection of being on the outside looking in. So we do it because we want to avoid that, or we want to gain social approval. So this is very much that Mean Girls reference once again. Okay? Why do you, maybe for example, drink at a party? Is it because you don't want to be on the outside looking in? Is it because you don't want your friends to make fun of you or the people there to say that you're like not cool or whatever or something like that? Why do you do what you do? Is it because you want to avoid rejection or gain social approval? If that's the route you're going, you're following normative social influence in terms of your level of conformity. The other way you could go would be informative social influence. And this is when we're going to align our behavior to the group standard because that group has pretty valuable information and we want to be accepting of the opinions of others, okay? Especially when it comes to making tough decisions. This, for example, is the entire reason why a president has a cabinet in the first place. It's to get other people's points of view, to hear, other possible pros and cons, things like that. And the nice thing is that when you have those kinds of circumstances, if you make a decision that the entire group has agreed upon, well, guess what? You're not the only one who made that call. Everybody is in that with you in terms of possible consequences at the end of the day. Okay, so you don't have to stand alone in tough decisions. As I make these videos for you, am the only AP Psych teacher here at the high school, but that hasn't always been the case. Let's say, for example, that when I've been working with my colleagues, we could take Intro to Psych because I have multiple other teachers that teach that with me. When we're coming up with an activity where we're deciding whether we want to keep a question on a test or something like that, as we make decisions and we talk about it and we all decide, okay, yeah, we're good, let's all go with this question, I then have an ability to kind of rationalize for myself, so to speak, that, well, if I got really bad responses on that test question, it's not just me. I wasn't the only one who made this decision. All of the other intro teachers made it too. So I'm not alone in that when it comes down to a sense of accountability. Now, let's switch gears a bit. Start talking about compliance. Compliance isn't the same as conformity, and it's not the same as obedience. Compliance is when you adjust your actions because of either an explicit or implicit request. Okay, so somebody is ultimately asking you to do something rather than demanding or telling. Okay, a lot of you guys love to say that I'm like a very demanding individual, and you follow me and you obey my orders. In many respects, what I do with you guys is a compliance piece. Okay, I put it out there to you and I pose it to you, but I don't demand it necessarily. So what could we do when we're talking about this whole explicit versus implicit piece here in terms of examples to get a better grasp of it? Explicit means there's a direct request. Implicit means it's indirect, okay? So how do we differentiate between this? We use some teacher examples here, okay? Because as I said, much of what I do is actually compliance-oriented, not obedience-oriented. Let's say that you are sitting there on your phone in class. You know better. You know you're not supposed to be sitting there on your phones, especially if I'm sitting there trying to clarify some content or making you guys do an activity, okay? Here's the thing. If I walked right up to you and I said straight to your face, hey, I need you to put that down away for me, please, and you do it, I've given you a direct request. I didn't demand anything of you. I didn't say, put that away now. I didn't do that. I just said, hey, I need you to put that away for me, please. Okay? It was a request. Now, how would I do this in terms of something implicit? All I would need to do is just walk over to you, stand right next to you, look at you, and smile. And let's be real. You know in that moment, I'm looking at you because you're texting when you're not supposed to be, or you're Snapchatting or Instagramming or whatever. And so you put it away. I don't even say anything to you. I never expressly state, put that away. I never ask, expressly to do it. I simply just smile at you. Okay? A lot of times, interestingly enough, compliance, in conjunction with that foot in the door phenomenon and door in the face stuff that we talked about earlier, can very heavily be used by salespeople, politicians, or as is the case for me and my occupation, teachers. So, let's go back. Let's talk about obedience very quickly, because this is going to be one of another very significant research pieces out there that you will absolutely need to know for that AP exam. Let's compare compliance with obedience. Obedience is when you adjust your behavior in response to a command. Okay, so you perceive a person to be in an authority position, and so you will follow that command. You don't obey a friend when they demand that you let them look at your homework and copy it. You're complying ultimately because they're not in a position of authority over you. They're a peer. They're an equal. But if you do something because a teacher demands it of you, then it's a circumstance of obedience. Okay? And so Stanley Milgram is going to be the guy who is very, very, very heavily connected to the study of obedience with his landmark, legendary study via the famous Milgram shock experiment study. So how exactly did this whole thing work? Ultimately, participants were brought in to this study and they were introduced to a learner. This learner was strapped into the electroshock machine you see here on the screen. And this learner was to receive increasing levels of voltage every time that they gave an answer to a question that was read by the participant of the study, this teacher. So every time that they got a question wrong, they were given increasing levels of shock, all the way up to anywhere from 435 to 450 volts, which would be near death, essentially. While the teacher was listening to these answers being given, the learner was on the other side of a wall, okay, so or like a curtain, so they weren't able to actually see this individual, but they did watch them get hooked up to the electroshock machine. And then in this room where the teacher was located was a researcher who was sitting there at this table watching them carry all of this out. What the teacher had been told was that they were attempting to study the impact of punishment on the learning process. What was actually happening was that learner right here who was strapped to this shock machine was a plant. They were a pseudo-participant. You're going to see kind of common themes of these pseudo-participants throughout a lot of these social psych examples. And so these people were part of the research piece. They were told to pretend that they were getting hurt. They were told to give wrong answers on purpose, because ultimately what the study wanted to look at wasn't the impact of punishment on learning, but why people will obey. This is coming in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials that occurred in the aftermath of all those Nazi higher-ups who were put on trial, and so many of them were saying and claiming that their defense was, I was following orders. And many people just couldn't understand how that could be a justification for doing what was done. But it will be Milgram's research and results that were just so surprising. I don't want to use shocking because that's just a terrible pun. But they were disturbing, to say the least, because 65%, almost 2/3 of individuals went to death levels of shock or just close to it. So they for all intents and purposes, they've nearly killed someone because an authority figure told them to do it. Even if these individuals felt very uncomfortable, they didn't like what they were doing, they demonstrated that visibly so. The researchers that were sitting at that table would just tell them, like, I'm the person taking responsibility for this, you just need to keep going, it's okay. And this all comes even after they had heard that the learner had a heart condition, and they still were willing to give this person shocks as this increasing level of involvement and engagement in this task went higher. Needless to say, everyone gave one shock, at least one. So they inflicted harm on another person because an authority figure told them to do it. And so that lends itself just toward how significant obedience is in explaining why people do what they do. Because the reality is, most of us, when we're in a circumstance that requires us to obey, we're going to rationalize our decision, okay? So think back to what those Nazi higher-ups did at the Nuremberg trials. They rationalized their behaviors by saying, well, I was following orders. They were trying to find a rational justification for what they did. For those in the participation of this study, their justification was that ultimately the experimenter was the one that was responsible. It wasn't them. They were the instrument, if you will, but ultimately it was the researcher telling them to continue, and so that's why they did. Some other very significant pieces to keep in mind when it comes to why people are willing to obey is the significance of the prestige or significance of the authority figure. Okay, so the higher their prestige is, the harder it is for you to disobey, right? So me as a lowly teacher in comparison to a principal, you're far more likely to obey the principal because ultimately they're kind of the head of this whole building, as opposed to just disobeying a teacher who, for you guys, you perceive as kind of like I see this person every day. They're just kind of like around and there. They don't necessarily hold as much authority. The presence of others impacts things too, because if others disobey, you're more inclined to do it too. That's a lot of the reason why you guys ultimately act like total lunatics out in the hallways during the change of class. There's tons of other people around not doing what they're supposed to, screaming at, profanity in the halls and yelling at one another, ignoring teachers, wearing hats, pulling your hoods up, all that other kind of stuff. If other people are doing that, you're far more likely to go in line with it because they're obeying too, so it ain't just you. Personality characteristics matter too, because the reality is we know that when you are different personality types, like those who are antagonistic by nature, you're going to be far more likely to disobey. And there are some who are far more compliant. They are conscientious individuals. They are people who try to get along well with others, and so they're not going to be as inclined to rock the boat, if you will. And so that's why they're willing to go along with things. Another scenario to keep in mind for yourself moving forward with all of this social influence component is the issue of a social dilemma, okay? Some kind of a situation that can connect in with some selfish behavior on your part that can benefit you in the short run, but it ends up hurting a lot more individuals in the long run, okay? And so a lot of times this can be prevalent in any number of circumstances that you see out there. For example, things like what we call the prisoner dilemma. So I'll move this out of the way so you can see all of it. Let's say two people are separated immediately after they get arrested for a serious crime. You see this all the time on crime shows and things along those lines. Now, the DA says they are guilty, believes they are guilty, but he or she doesn't have the evidence to convict those people that have been separated. The question becomes then, ultimately, either they can confess, these individuals can, or not. Now, the DA gives them this ultimate dilemma here, okay? If both refuse to confess, they're each going to be convicted of a minor offense, and they will get jail for a year, okay? So it's kind of a plea deal-ishy kind of a thing. If both confess, the DA recommends a 5-year sentence. If one stays silent and one confesses, the one who confesses goes free. The other has a max jail sentence of 10 years. So those are the three options. Obviously, this is very much an avoidance style scenario, even a multi-avoidance style scenario, because the reality is, like, none of these are terribly favorable. Jail time is going to be involved for someone, right? And if it's not, and you're down here, like, this isn't exactly going to benefit you. If you hold your tongue for all intents and purposes and try to keep that to yourself, and the other person confesses, they get off scot-free. So what's the best way to handle this? Because the reality is, most people are going to say, well, I'm going to confess then, and I'm going to try to screw the other person over. But the problem is, if you confess and they also confess, well, then you both confess, so then you're both going to jail for 5 years because you guys are separated and you don't know what the other person's going to do. Your best outcome, it's going to go through cooperation. So it's short sentences for both. Neither confess, both serve a year. Okay? Is it likely to happen? Probably not, because an awful lot of our motivation in many respects is indicative of us individually. We're going to do what's best for us. We're going to focus on ourselves and what's going to better our situation. So the likelihood of that happening is pretty minimal. All right, let's talk about some other scenarios of behavior in the presence of others. You're very familiar with these terms. You might not realize it, but you are. Trust me, you demonstrate an awful lot of this stuff in any given day. Let's talk about social facilitation. Okay, we have improved performance on certain tests when we are in the presence of others. So, for example, this best explains why you perform an awful lot better at games than you do in practice. There's an audience, there's a crowd, so you have a tendency to do pretty well on those kinds of tasks. Now, to be fair, the type of task matters, because it's going to, more often than not, social facilitation is going to happen when the tasks are simple or very well learned, in the sense that they're kind of old habit for you. Difficult or not yet mastered tasks we're not going to do as well, and a lot of that is because we're going to, for all intents and purposes, become very self-conscious while we're in the presence of others, and we're going to feel like a lot of people are staring at us and judging us and things along those lines. So that's an important piece to kind of recognize there. Social loafing is when you're in a group, and ultimately, because you're in a group, y'all have the tendency to work less in terms of your energy level, if you will. When there are a decent number of people in a group, a lot of people bow out in terms of their responsibility, okay? The question becomes why. If you're put in a group project, why is it that a lot of people kind of tend to shirk their duties, so to speak, and there's one person kind of footing the bill and the responsibilities for everybody else? The reality is, the reason you do it is because you feel less accountable. There's other people involved, so you feel like you don't have to do as much that way. You might view your contribution to be pretty insignificant. And so, excuse me, my apologies there. The reality is, then you could ultimately end up feeling like your contribution doesn't matter, so no big thing. Now, something that can also kind of lend toward a significant impact on our behavior that has a social or group leaning to it is de-individuation. You're very familiar with de-individuation in mob mentality. When we become very less aware of ourselves, we don't operate on a significant amount of self-restraint, and so that ends up lending itself toward us feeling very like anonymous, in the sense of, hey, nobody's going to know who we are. And ultimately what we do is diffuse responsibility, okay? We spread it around because we feel like, hey, I'm part of this larger group. I don't feel like anyone's going to point me out. And so I feel less accountable for what I do, so I will choose to do things that I normally would not. And a lot of times that ends up being illegal kinds of behaviors. So in 2001, there was a very substantial situation here in Cincinnati that involved race riots. They took place in Over the Rhine and other parts of downtown. They even came up into Cheviot and Westwood. And so it was, you know, a very heightened time of tension, lots of arousal in the states of, you know, a lot of conflict happening there. And so what you saw was quite a few individuals who were, you know, putting bandanas over their faces. They were pulling their hoods up. They were wearing lots of stuff to hide their face, under the perception that, hey, nobody can really point me out because there's lots of people out here demonstrating and protesting. And so things unfortunately turned very violent at different points throughout this experience. And so, you know, you see this an awful lot when it comes to rioting, where people just completely devolve and stop holding themselves to a sense of self-restraint. And a lot of that comes because they just feel like they're anonymous and part of a crowd. And so that diffusion of responsibility piece is very, very, very significant. You'll hear me make reference to diffusion of responsibility on numerous occasions because it's just such a powerful contextual piece to why people do what they do or don't do what they do in group dynamics especially. Now, let's switch gears to talk a little bit about other group impacts on your individual behavior. So group polarization is when you are in a group setting, you guys are trying to come to a decision on a particular topic, okay? And what occurs is the group's predominant thought or attitude toward that topic becomes stronger and stronger and stronger toward that one particular action, okay? If a group is like-minded, the discussion of that feeling that they have will strengthen and end up prevailing in the opinions and the attitudes of those individuals. So let's give an example here, because as itself is present, you know, as this is presented to you, I'm sure you're probably sitting there thinking like, this is kind of hard for me to follow. So let's say, for example, I'm going to use a situation that's pretty common for us teachers. When we get together, we have common planning. We talk about tasks and things along those lines. You heard me make reference to this example in an earlier video to you. Let's say we come across a test question, okay, that we'll do intro to psych, so it's a little bit different. All right, so I'm meeting with the other intro to psych teachers. We come across this question. Turns out kids did really poorly on it last semester. And so we're talking about this question, should we keep it, should we not? As we're having this conversation and we're having this discussion, ultimately what ends up happening is through that conversation, we end up coming to that, you know, agreed upon conclusion, all of us, that the prevailing attitude we have toward that is we should keep it. It's a challenging question. If the kids are discerning enough and they have the right skill set, they should be able to answer the question accurately. As we've talked about that, we become more and more and more convinced in our course of action that it is the right thing to do to keep that test question in there, because we're talking about it and we're bouncing it off of one another, okay? It's possible that group polarization can be helpful. I mean, certainly when you're trying to come up with ideas on how to, you know, for example, run the country. That's ultimately a very similar circumstance to what happens with cabinet members and the president and things along those lines. It could be harmful too. It's important to recognize that talking over things can be very, very, very significant in causing people to go a certain way. There is a very, very, very well-known scenario of group polarization being harmful, and that was the meeting in Wannsee in Germany to establish what became known as the final solution and the eradication of millions of Jews from the face of this planet. As all of those Nazi members sat around a table and talked about this decision, they became more and more and more convinced that this was the route that needed to go. The bottom line with group polarization to recognize is you leave more fired up or strong in your convictions, if you will, one way than the other, than when you first arrived, okay? So it can have a very heightened impact on a group's decision-making processes. So can groupthink. Groupthink is different than group polarization because the guiding light here isn't necessarily the situation you've got back here where it's just like, you know, you're strengthening a prevailing opinion. Okay? What happens here in groupthink is the guiding principle is a desire for harmony. Okay, so everybody has to be all set and all on board for this circumstance. And a lot of times what that ends up doing is you suppress critical points that would, discuss flaws or things along those lines in a decision-making process. So why would that happen? Why would a person not speak up if they think that a decision is just going to be absolutely disastrous? Well, they don't want to make waves, in the sense that they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to cause problems. They don't want to be seen as that person who just everybody, glares at, just like, oh my God, why are you making this so much more difficult? So they ultimately end up going along with the decision and the rest of the group, because of that very nature. Okay, so it's more of an issue of desiring for harmony. A very well-known, actually there's two very well-known groupthink scenarios that occurred in historical circumstances to lead to pretty significant consequences. One of the more prominently well-known scenarios of groupthink is the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened in the 1960s. The Bay of Pigs fiasco in the 1960s. When the American government thought that it would be a very solid move to attempt to remove Fidel Castro from power in the manner that they pulled up. The reality was, in looking back at it, it was just an absolute disaster and one of the biggest embarrassments of JFK's presidency. Another very common groupthink scenario that connects to politics that is often referenced in psychological circles for this content is the weapons of mass destruction decision-making process that connected into our decision to ultimately attempt to remove Saddam Hussein from power and invade Iraq in the process of things. It became known after the fact that the evidence ultimately was very questionable as to whether Saddam Hussein truly did have weapons of mass destruction, and there seemed to be an awful lot of groupthink happening there in that decision back in the early 2000s to go and invade and remove Saddam Hussein from power. So, bottom line to all of this is that the reality that many of you guys hopefully have come to, or at least you should have come to by this point, is that social psychology really does explain an awful lot of why you do what you do, and group dynamics in particular are very, 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 very influential in how it is that you behave. We're going to spend an awful lot more time in class with one another discussing how all of these things are more prevalent in your everyday life, because the reality is you guys operate on groupthink an awful lot in here in particular, and we'll discuss that. We'll talk about group polarization and many of these other terms. But since this is just an introduction for you, we're going to try to cut it off here at this point. So, you've reached the end of your social influence notes. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll keep on trucking.